Ladies and gentlemen, please help me welcome the 46th Governor of the Free State of Florida, Ron DeSantis. Thank you so much. Really appreciate it.
Oh, thank you. Oh, no, thanks. Please be seated. Great to be here. Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here. I was telling these folks when we met just briefly in a roundtable that I can never miss an opportunity to visit some of my future constituents. And so I know I will see some of you, and it's become a cottage industry. I will tell you this. We've always had people come to Florida from the north, but particularly from the northeast. So that's not anything new, but when I became governor, a year into it, we had COVID. Of course, we had a big contrast between what life was like in Florida versus others. And I remember people that were in like Chicago for like 6 months and then they landed. It was like another civilization almost. It was shocking to them. It was doing, but we started to see the migration really pick up. And so it got to the point where, Florida was always a one-point state. If you look the decade leading into when I got elected, these races, presidential, gubernatorial, were 1 point or less. Mine was even less than that. And so it was kind of this delicate balance that we had, and you got to try to figure out a way to do it. So when they started to see the migration, a lot of my supporters were really spooked, because they're like, how are these people going to vote? So you actually had people, this is on their own dime, they would print out things, they'd go to the supermarket, they'd find anyone with New York plates, they'd put it in the windshield, and it would say, do not vote down here like they vote up there. And people were really worried about it. And California, too. I mean, New York is not like new to move to Florida. I grew up in Florida, born and raised. I don't remember ever seeing a California license plate. We started to see California license plates, and that really spooked a lot of people. We're like, we don't need to import Berkeley, to Tampa Bay or anything like that. But I'll tell you, what's ended up happening is when I got elected, it's not just the migration, but clearly the migration has been purposeful in terms of the type of governance that people were looking for. Because when I got elected the first time, we had 300,000 more registered Democrats in the state of Florida, and we had never had more registered Republicans than Democrats in the history of the state of Florida. By the time I got reelected 4 years later, we had flipped that on its head, and we actually had 300,000 more registered Republicans than Democrats, and we ended up winning that election by a record 20 points, 1.5 million vote margin. But it gets even better because 2 years later, 2024 election, we didn't have just a 300,000 registration advantage. We had a 1.1 million voter registration advantage. And so that's in 6 years to go from 300,000 in the hole to 1.1 million in the black. And now I think we're probably pretty close to 1.2 million. So I do think that the migration we had were overwhelmingly people that were coming to Florida because of what we were doing. And they were sick of the nonsense, and not just liberal nonsense, tax and spend, traditional liberalism. I think it was a leftism that was really fueled by this woke ideology and the woke mind virus. You saw the COVID restrictions. It's one thing to have done that at the start and made some mistakes, but if you didn't look after 6, 8, 12 weeks of this and realize that these policies were harmful, you were not looking at the data. I think a lot of people were really frustrated because it's one thing to disagree, but when the data was so clear, hey, kids in Florida are in school. They're not dropping dead. Why can't you have kids in school here? Obviously, the teacher unions didn't want to go to work, but why? Is there any reason why you couldn't do it? So we started to see that, and we now have a reputation of, look, if you look at a lot of the things that the president's doing now, a lot of the executive orders against DEI, critical race, all that, the women's sports, Florida, we did that years ago. In fact, it was like 4 years ago we signed women's sports protections. We were the first state in the country to eliminate DEI from our public universities. And we were going to war not just with the teacher unions on things like critical race theory, but even taking on Disney about gender ideology in the schools, believe it or not. They thought that was something good. So the approach matters, the governance matters. I just think it's comical that I just submitted my budget for this coming year on Monday. So I think New York has about 19.5 million residents. Florida is over 23 million. We're probably getting close to 23.5 million. So 4 million more people in Florida, and yet New York's budget is over twice the size of the state of Florida's budget. In fact, New York City's budget is larger than the budget for the entire state of Florida. But when people move down, what will they tell me? Oh, Governor, your roads are nicer down here. Oh, Governor, I got my driver's license in 5 minutes. Oh, Governor, your schools are doing better. So something is really wrong about how they're using tax dollars here. And in Florida, we have no income tax, and that will always be the case, and we're proud of that. And yes, we have the second lowest state tax burden of anywhere in the country. I'm working on I can't do it through the legislature. I got to put it on the ballot. We want to reduce property taxes in Florida and cap that. And I think that'll make it even better. So stay tuned on that. But we've done that. But even though in my budget this year reduces spending, so we'll have 3 years of basically no spending increases, which even in a time of inflation is very hard to do. But as we're doing that, fiscal responsibility, low taxes, we've had record support for restoring Florida's Everglades, which is something that's important to people in our state, and that's billions of dollars. We've done more increases in education, both for school choice, but also for teacher salaries, charter school, public school, you name it, we've done it. We've done programs to recruit cops. We've got a lot of cops that have moved from NYPD, and they get a $5,000 bonus. We've accelerated road projects because the state's booming and people are coming, and you got to get ahead of it. So there were projects that weren't even expected to start till next decade that are going to be done 10, 15 years ahead of schedule because we did an infusion of billions and billions of dollars there. And yet, with all of those things being taken care of, we've managed to, if you look at Florida's debt from the 1840s until I became governor, we've paid down 36% of the state's historical debt, and my budget this year will bring us to having paid down 49% of Florida's entire debt for its entire history. So this can be done, right? I look forward to answering your question, but I think the one point of why I think we've been successful, both in terms of the results, but also the political response in terms of the organic change in the political demography. Because it wasn't because we did voter registration drives. I mean, if you could go from 300,000 to 1.1 million with just voter registration drives, everyone would do it, right? No, this is organic. We were getting people to shift from being Dems to Republicans. Our brand in Florida as Republicans is strong. That's not necessarily the case in other parts of the country. Maybe it'll be better nationally with what Trump's doing and how bad the Democrats are. But in Florida, you race to try to get an R by your name now. That wasn't always the case. And I think it is because when I go in, my view is in order to protect your freedom, I've got to protect you from the pathologies of the political left, wherever they may be. So yes, when I became governor, I had the opportunity to replace 3 liberal Supreme Court justices with 3 conservative Supreme Court justices, taking a very liberal court for many decades and turning it into maybe the nation's most conservative state Supreme Court. So, the left had captured that institution for decades. We took it back. If you look at what we've done for universal school choice, the left has captured education. We're taking it back, not just by giving universal school choice, but parental Bill of Rights and parental involvement in the education so that when they're teaching a 4th grader that they were born in the wrong body, you can call them on it, and they will stop doing that under state law, even in the public schools. We also did paycheck protection for teacher union dues. And so you now have Miami-Dade, Broward, major counties, urban counties, they're on the brink of those teacher unions being decertified entirely because they don't have enough teachers signing up. So that was an organ of the left trying to use education to indoctrinate the kids. We beat that back. Anytime we see, we do. Now, universities. We have basically overhauled how higher education's done, particularly with respect to tenure. So all tenured professors must undergo review every 5 years and can be let go for poor performance. And we have filtered out a lot of professors over the last many years. We've also eliminated programs in some of our universities like gender studies. We have stopped requiring sociology for all of our undergrads because we see where the indoctrination is coming, and we're reshoring this onto a classical foundation of what a university is supposed to be: the pursuit of truth, teaching people how to think and how to debate, and preparing people to be citizens of the republic. And so the left thought that they own the universities, and we're showing that that's not the case. Where sometimes it can become a little bit more touchy for people on the center right is when you start talking about activities in the private sector. And there's definitely a train of thought, and I mean, honestly, when I was younger, I was sympathetic to this. You know, our job is to police government and to rein government in and to make sure, and if we just do that, everything's gonna be fine. And our founders, some of them believe that, but I think they were also operating in a different environment in terms of the health of certain institutions. What I found is if you just say we're going to cut taxes, we're going to limit government, and then we're just going to do nothing else, the left's going to win. The left will win. And so, for example, when we had to do the fight against Disney, we were in a situation where this gender ideology was sweeping the country. They were trying to get it into even elementary schools, where basically you were taught, hey, just pick what you want to be, right? You know, you're born, oh, well, it's whatever the doctor assigned you that at birth, but that's not really, and it's just crazy that they were going down this road. And so we had legislation to say we're nipping that in the bud in the state of Florida. Disney fought us on that and basically demagogued it. The whole thing was demagogued by the media. And so we had to make a decision. Anyone that knows anything about Florida politics knows Disney runs the show, or at least did until I came on the scene. They basically would get what they wanted. Nobody would ever stand up. And so we had to stand up and win that fight. But it wasn't as simple as just getting the Parents' Rights Bill passed. We also had to look at the landscape. Disney was sitting on this ridiculous set of special privileges that they had enjoyed for many decades, where they actually owned and operated their own local government. And so Universal Studios wanted to do something, they had to do it like a normal business. Disney could basically just not tax itself, they would tax other businesses and do, I mean, it was the biggest form of corporate welfare that we've ever had, that we've ever seen. I don't think there's ever been an example like that. And so the issue is they were always so powerful, no one would even talk about it. Well, then this happened, we said, okay, are we gonna let them weaponize these ridiculous subsidies against our kids and our parents? I mean, how ridiculous is that? So I work with the members of the legislature. I said, guys, we gotta yank this back. I mean, we cannot be subsidizing this nonsense. And so when people say, oh, you're fighting with Disney, we were removing special privileges that should not have been there in the first place, put them on the same playing field as everybody else, because it's just not right that they would be able to leverage the state's generosity and then weaponize that against the citizens of Florida. And so every single stage in that fight, the media would say, oh, he can't go up against Disney. Oh, well, he did that. Oh, you can't take away the privileges. Oh, Disney's going to leave Florida. Oh, this. So now what's happened? The state, we control the local government there with a control board. They've cut taxes for businesses. They've rooted out waste. They've allowed local businesses to compete for contracts with competitive bidding. Disney's no longer in control. And how did they respond? Did they pick up and move to Columbus, Ohio? No, they've announced $18 billion in investment in the future. And so this is just what you have to do. You got to be willing to have those fights. Had we not had that fight with them, that was one of the most important fights to stem the tide of woke activism in corporate America. Because it always been thought like, oh, if you offend the left, they'll show up and they'll protest and they'll do this and it'll be bad for you. But you can offend the right with impunity and they'll never do anything. Well, they saw that we're willing to fight back. So we did that. Another example that's sometimes touchy with people on the center right is when we were fighting the COVID. we had to make a decision. It's one thing to say government can't restrict you, but we had a lot of private businesses, I think probably September of 2021, they were imposing mRNA shot mandates on their employees. And so I think the default for a lot of people on the right is, well, businesses can kind of set the criteria, this or that, and there may be some instances where they've done similar that people haven't objected to. And I respected that. But what I also saw was these businesses were doing this because they were swept up in this ridiculous hysteria about COVID and about saying people weren't able to make decisions about what was right for themselves. The fact is, those shots it was questionable whether many people even needed them, especially young and healthy people. They hadn't gone through the normal process, and we provided, people could get them in Florida if they wanted it, but they should not have been required to do it. So I called the legislature in, and we basically just said, you have a right to work without being put to this choice. No one should have to choose between a shot they don't want and a job that they need. So we did it. Some people said it was not fair, but we ended up saving tens of thousands of jobs for people. We did the same thing for the police and the fire and everything like that. So you look at it and say, okay, you're going to say, well, businesses can do what they want, or are you going to say no? We are in a situation where people have lost their damn minds, and we're just going to bring some sanity to this, and sometimes it requires you to do some legislation to be able to do it. And then final example along these lines is I signed legislation last year that prohibited the cultivation and production and sale of lab-grown meat. So this is not like veggie burger or something. This is like they grow it in the lab, they do it. And people say, oh, well, why are you to say it's not good for someone? I'm not saying it's good or not good. It may be fine for you. That's not why I signed the bill. The reason I signed the bill is because the people in like Davos at the World Economic Forum that say global warming and climate change, and that's their whole ideology, they point to agriculture and cattle and like the farts from these cows as being this major, major problem. And so, yes, could you choose to do lab-grown or regular? I'm not trying to regulate that choice, but what I know this is part of a larger plan. They want to be able to get the lab grown out so eventually they can say, well, listen, you don't need to raise cattle. You don't need real meat. You have the lab grown meat. That wasn't going to happen next year, 5 years from now, maybe not even 10 years from now, but that was the plan. That was the motivation for why these people are doing it. So I'm like, do I really want them to get a foothold on this, or do I just want to nip it in the bud right now? So that's why we did it, because I think policies that are done with like the World Economic Forum just need to be dead on arrival in the state of Florida. So we signed the legislation and people will be fine. So you gotta fight the left wherever they are. The battle is not limited to judicial decisions. It's not limited to legislative acts. Yes, it does include what goes on in our universities, what goes on in corporate America. And I will say, when we were fighting, the first one to fight a lot of these fights, we were fighting against the teeth of a pretty stiff breeze. And a lot of times we were standing all alone. Now I think we've got the wind at our back. You don't have much problem in Florida with any of this nonsense anymore. We have said that we're the state where woke goes to die, and I think that that has been something that's been proven out year after year. So the fight is broad. I would love to get back to a point in this country where all we have to worry about is limiting government and nothing else, because the rest of our institutions are healthy, our universities are healthy, our business culture is healthy, all these things are healthy. I think that would be the best for this country, but that's not where we are right now. And if someone is really standing up to fight for your freedom and your liberty, they will recognize that that is the case. Thank you all. God bless you. Sit here.
Well, thank you again so much, Governor DeSantis, for your remarks. I'm going to invite Sheldon to come on down, and we will begin the Q&A portion of our program. Thanks again.
Governor, that was stirring, a defense of freedom. Thank you so much for joining us here tonight. We have an amazing audience of Federalist Society members tonight. We have law students, we have professors, we have big law attorneys, we have judges, we have every possible walk of the profession of law in the room tonight, and they have lots of questions for you.
Shoot.
All right. Well, we want to start with what I think has to be your most consequential election. I'm, of course, talking about 2001, when your teammates at Yale voted you as team captain of your baseball team. And I think that's probably you talked a lot about your other elections, but we haven't heard much about that one.
Well, it's interesting. So, every varsity sport has one captain, and it's kind of like a big deal. Like literally, you take a picture with like the Yale sweater on a fence, and then they put it on. They hang it the next year, and in different parts of campus. And so when you do it, but then the baseball team just happened to have a lineage that went back that included Bush 41. So he was 1948 captain. And so I'm the captain in 2001, and that was Yale's tercentennial celebration. And so they had Bush 40. So Bush 41 was out of office. W had just taken the reins, but they had 41 come in to give kind of the big speech. And I guess he wanted to come say hi to the baseball team. So I'm going out to practice, and people are asking me like, you going to get out there? Like something was amiss. I could tell. My coach pulls me aside. He points to the left field bullpen. I see these guys with like the things in their ears and the suits. He's like, you see those guys out there? Those are Secret Service agents. George Bush is here, and I wanted you to tell your guys, don't drop any F-bombs in front of the former president. So he came out. But, for me at the time, I don't know that I had ever met anybody famous. I was 21 years old. I grew up in Dunedin, Florida. And so to see that was interesting, and it was probably not where I thought I would have been, even 10 years prior.
Well, I looked at some of the news coverage from then, and I keep my notes in my pocket constitution. Oh, and by the way, if you have a pocket constitution, you have to do a new thing now. You got to go to the back, you got to count the number of amendments, and you got to make sure it's only 27. But I loved this quote from one of your teammates in 2001. You are a true leader on and off the field. So going back to 2001 on the Yale baseball team, that's your legacy. For the benefit of the audience here, want to explore a little bit about your decision to go into law. So you had an amazing baseball career at Yale. Why did you decide to go to law school?
It was interesting. I graduated college, before 9/11. And so I ended up doing the military, but that was not necessarily on the radar. I mean, when you grew up in the 90s, post-Cold War, we had no care in the world. I mean, it was honestly a great time to be a teenager looking back on it. And so the law, one of the things I was interested in as just a baseball player, as somebody that wanted to stay in, was being able to parlay that maybe into baseball executive type. And a lot of I've got teammates that are general managers, Orioles GMs, a Yale baseball guy, Boston GMs, a Yale baseball guy. So I was kind of looking in maybe that perspective. And then what happened was when 9/11 happened, I commissioned with the Navy, and since I was already in Harvard Law School, we got the commission with JAG, and then eventually did that. But I definitely think my path changed as a result of 9/11. Obviously, that's very raw for a lot of people in New York City, but even just for me being, somewhere that grew up in Florida, it changed my perspective on the world, and it changed my perspective on what I wanted to do with my life, and I wanted to serve, and so we were able to do that.
That's remarkable. You had a chance earlier today to meet a number of our student volunteers. I'm sure you've seen lots of news coverage across the country about incidents on campus where speakers are shouted down, where students don't get a chance to share their perspectives and ideas on conservative issues. Take us back in time to when you were a 1L, and I think you joined the Federalist Society as a 1L. What was that experience like as a conservative law student on campus then? And what concerns do you have about the environment on campus today?
Oh, I think it's way worse today. There was obviously a leftist orthodoxy, although I will tell you, Harvard Law School, it was kind of more of a factory. It was, hard, you go to Yale, it's like academics and judges is kind of what they're trying to train. Harvard, the nuts and bolts is corporate litigators, people that can do transactional law at the very highest levels in the private sector. And so it was really, kind of like punching your card. So there really wasn't as much activism there as I thought I anticipated, having come from Yale undergrad. Definitely a leftist bent, but I don't think the Harvard, when I was there, would be considered even close to as left-wing as what's happened now. Now, we've actually, in Florida, we lean in against this nonsense. So I got this little liberal arts college called New College, and it's in Sarasota. I remember the Speaker of the House came to see me. He's like, I want to talk to you about New College. I was like, we don't need any new colleges. What are you talking about? It's like, no. I was like, what is that? I didn't even know what it was. And it turned out it was like supposed to be our top honors college. It had descended into like basically a Marxist commune. There was like 480 students total and stuff. And I'm like, well, why are we doing this? Let's just close it. And then we didn't have support to do that. So I'm like, all right, I'm going to take over the board. So I put conservatives on the board. They fired the president, hired a conservative president. They immediately eliminated the gender studies department. And they said, we are going to be a classical liberal arts college, similar to like what Hillsdale would be in Michigan. But one of the things they did was they reinstituted the student code of conduct. So they had a commencement speaker later that spring, and you had about 8 students that were just screaming and ruining it for everybody else. And so the president of the university withheld their diplomas. And they said, you know what? You write a letter of apology to the speaker, and you write a letter of apology to the rest of the student body and their families, and then maybe you get your diploma. But if you don't do that, you're out of luck. And so being able to just say, we are going to have standards of conduct. You can say what you want, but you don't have a right to ruin these engagements. You don't have a right to shout people down. And I think the universities, they let the inmates run the asylum. We don't do that in Florida. Some of these Hamas folks, we dealt with. And now with Trump, if they're a foreign student and they're doing stuff with Hamas, my thing is like, these are valuable spots. Why am I giving a spot to them? We should send them back and bring an American kid in. So we have taken action at universities to ensure that people have the right to say things without being shouted down. And we don't police the speech, but we do police the conduct. And if your conduct is disruptive or doesn't live up to current standards, once you start holding some of these people accountable, man, it's amazing how behavior improves.
Let's take so we talked a little bit about your law school experience. Let's go a little bit further. You mentioned that you joined the military, joined the Navy, joined the JAG Corps. Guantanamo is back in the news today. You had a position as an advisor in Guantanamo. Can you talk a little bit about that experience as an advisor in that capacity?
Yeah, there was such a hot button with the media on the left, and then you go down there, and it's like there were various levels. There were some that people were just in open air. They play soccer all day. These are kind of more the minimum security guys. And then you'd have like Khalid Sheikh Mohammed was in like a maximum security prison. You would know it's no different from what you would see like a federal prison. So it was very professionally run. I think the things that people say about it were exaggerated or just outright false. Now, the question of if you're an enemy combatant, a terrorist, do you get trials in U.S. courts? I don't think you do, but that's the kind of what happened there. Now, on the illegal alien stuff, we have been fighting this battle for a long time with Biden. I had people helping Texas at the border. We have had boats in South Florida because remember, when Haiti started to really have trouble a year ago, people were predicting like 50,000 Haitians would wash ashore of Florida. No, I put boats out there. We stopped the boats. Coast Guard sent them back. We interdicted and repatriated 18,000 in the last year alone and seized 500 vessels. So we've been, and we even transported illegal aliens to places like California and beautiful Martha's Vineyard. So we've been involved in this a lot. And had we not done the Martha's Vineyard, people were not talking about the border until we did the Martha's Vineyard. Then all of a sudden you see, and it wasn't like, yes, we understood Martha's Vineyard claimed to be a sanctuary. They even had a refugee resettlement office in their downtown. It was all for show, but it said nobody's illegal, everyone's welcome. And then the minute they get 50, they freak out, call out the guard, and deport them immediately. So you're doing all that. So we have a lot of muscle. We do well with emergency situations generally. I mean, people see us do the hurricanes and the response to that. But, I flew a bunch of people back from Israel after October 7th who were caught there. I flew people out of Haiti, Americans out of Haiti, when that started going down. So we will be working with the federal government to help supplement their Gitmo mission. So we've got these Venezuelan gang members in Florida that we've rounded up. We've got probably a lot more. So you very well may see Florida helping to repatriate some of these people to Gitmo.
As I hear you talk about this, your experience as a governor, both on the opposite side of an administration previously and now cooperating with an administration now, you're really kind of the walking embodiment of federalism. You've had so many experiences, both as an executive of a state, but before that, you served in the U.S. Congress. You've kind of been in all the different branches of government. You've been in the legislative branch in the U.S. House of Representatives. You've been in the executive branch at the state level as the chief executive of the state of Florida. And of course, as you mentioned in your remarks, one of your most notable legacies as governor of Florida is tied to the judicial branch. Separation of powers is kind of embodied in all of your work. Can we go back to when you were in the U.S. House of Representatives and talk a little bit about that experience? And from your perspective, why is a healthy legislative branch important to our system of government?
Well, if you look at what Elon Musk is doing with this Doge, and they've been doing this USAID, I know they're getting to get into other things, and the corruption in how this money is being spent, all the things that they're uncovering. And I mean, honestly, I think a lot of us knew that a lot of this was going on, but yeah, our Congress has never done anything about any of that. The last 15 years, we've had Republican control of the U.S. House more than we've had Democrat control of the U.S. House. The House of Representatives has the power of the purse. If there's something that is being harmful or violating people's rights or mismanaged, they just can simply withhold funding. They are under no obligation to fund this crap year after year. And yet, when you do omnibus bills with massive thousands of pages, nobody reads, it gets plopped on the floor and passed, or a continuing resolution which just continues everything with really no changes, when that becomes the norm, which it has been over the last 10, 15 years, that gives license to the bureaucrats to run wild because they know they're never going to be held accountable. And so the weakness of Congress is the number one reason why we've had the growth of this fourth branch of government. Sometimes Congress is intentionally empowering the bureaucracy because they don't want to have to go on the record and make tough decisions, so they will punt it to the bureaucrats and then blame the bureaucrats for things going wrong. So when I was a congressman, most of the people that would come to my office and complain were not complaining about any vote I took. They were complaining about what bureaucracies were doing to them and what rules were coming down. So you do have that, but then you also have this neglect of ceding your most potent power of the purse, which allows the bureaucracy to take advantage of this. And so I saw that firsthand, how impotent they were. And why are they impotent? Because they're like, well, we can't shut down the government. We just got to keep it moving. Otherwise, they're going to blame us and all this stuff. And I'm just thinking to myself, okay, well, if the main thing is not ever having a lapse in appropriations, then don't turn around and complain about the fourth branch of government because you're giving up the game. You're giving up your major power. So I saw that over and over again. And I think what Musk is doing is great, but here's the problem. Ultimately, if you want to reduce spending, you can't just do that with Elon and a bunch of his friends. Congress has to enact these changes through law. And I am not optimistic that they are of the mind to reduce spending even minimally, but certainly not the type of spending restraint that we would need to get us back. I mean, if we could just return to 2019 levels of spending and just froze that for Trump's administration, even if it was just non-defense, that would make a huge difference. I don't think they'll take anything back to 29 is what I would guess, because this is just the culture that's there. One of the things that I've recommended, we're pushing for a balanced budget amendment to the federal Constitution. We're pushing for term limits for members of Congress, and we're pushing for a line item veto for the president. Those are all things that would be constitutional changes, but the incentive structure in Congress right now, I don't think you're going to end up seeing any major positive changes, especially given Republicans have such a narrow majority. My advice to them would be, don't worry about getting reelected. Your majority is so narrow, you're probably going to lose the House anyways. Take this as like a once-in-a-generation inflection point. Go as big as you can, and just let the chips fall where they may. But I don't think that that's what's going to happen. And so I think that Elon is doing good work. I think there's probably things Trump can do administratively, but you are not going to be able to tame the Leviathan if Congress continues to fund it without condition.
So let's talk a little bit about executive power. You serve in the U.S. House of Representatives. You talk a little bit about some of the culture there, where there's an inability to take action and unwillingness to take action. You run for governor, are elected governor of Florida. Our members here have lots of questions about your legacy and your decision-making as governor of Florida, but there's basically 3 buckets of questions about your legacy. First, want to talk a little bit about COVID. Second, there are a lot of questions here about DEI and your approach to DEI and ESG type issues in the state of Florida. And finally, you can't have a group of lawyers that don't want to hear about judges. So we will have to ask some questions about your philosophy on judges. But let's start with COVID. You talked a little bit about the experience, but one of the questions from one of our members is, what was the pushback like when you started adopting certain policy responses to COVID, and how did you and the members of your administration react and respond to that pushback?
Well, first, before I got into office, I had my folks draft me up all the powers of the governor, constitutional, statutory, customary, so I knew what pressure points I had to be able to work with. So, for example, I got into office. First week, I removed the sheriff of Broward County who had presided over the Parkland massacre and failed. And he had that was February of 2018. I got in January 2019. That was not a power my predecessor really exercised. And so, my view is it's not big government. It's what is constitutional government. What are my authorities? And I'm going to be an energetic executive and use the leverage I have to be able to move things in a direction that's going to benefit. So that was kind of my mindset going in. Now, COVID kind of flipped the script a little bit because, we have local governments. And so what was happening in Florida was Miami-Dade shut down when Fauci was going crazy. Broward shut down. Palm Beach shut down. Orange, Hillsborough, the big urban counties are all shutting down, and they even tried to arrest a pastor. So I had to come in and say, okay, we'll do essential businesses, but you have a right to go to church, you have a right to do all this. And so I actually was liberating it. When people say what Florida had restrictions, those were local restrictions that were done. So I was liberating for those counties to try to just get a happy medium to get us through those 2 or 4 weeks. But then when we got to mid-April, I'm like, I'm done with this. We can't do it. And so we moved forward. We got people kind of out of that with modest things like, we didn't open the stadiums and everything right away with the big crowds. But the opposition was more intense than anything I've ever had by a country mile in the political arena, whether a campaign type deal or this. And so, I was in a situation where I was reading the data after 6 weeks of COVID. And my view is you are not going to eradicate this by shutting down. It is out. It is highly contagious. It is also not terribly harmful to young people and people that are in really good shape specifically. So you're looking at elderly and you're looking at people with comorbidities by and large. I mean, it doesn't mean there aren't outliers, but what's the approach to that? And the approach to that is you got to keep society moving. You had to get the kids in school, and you had to basically say people have a right to operate businesses and people have a right to work. And they can make individual decisions, but you couldn't have government. So a lot of my executive actions from kind of the end of April on were taking emergency measures to limit what local governments can do. So I limited or banned their ability to close schools. I said all schools must be open. The teacher union sued me. We won. Kids are in school. No one will admit, and today they oppose me on that. They will all say they were for kids in school. That was not true. Even a lot of Republicans were not necessarily in favor. We said you can't close businesses. You can't do that. Everyone has a right to work. That was done by executive order in emergency situation. Did I have the full authority to do it? I mean, look, they could have litigated, but I think what happened is, as I was doing this stuff, you know, people were able to then respond, and they have their business open, the kids are in school. So we created a momentum, even though the media was against us, even though perhaps public opinion was against us, that after 4, 5, 6 months, Florida, everyone was like, oh, well, we got to go to Florida, we got to go to Florida. And so literally 6 months after I started doing these very controversial things, you know, everyone was on, a lot of people were on board. The media was never on board. They were always attacking me. But it was just a situation where I had to use executive power vis-a-vis cities and counties, and that was the main thing. And some of that was not easy because a lot of the people on those local governments were very much into the code. Fauci would come down to Florida, and he would do local interviews on local news, trashing that we had kids in school, trashing that our business. He hated restaurants being open. To this day, I go into a restaurant and server will give me a hug saying, you saved my job, that there's no way we could have done this, but you protected us. They wanted us closed and you kept us open kind of deal. But that's kind of what was going on. So you just had to look at the data, know what you believed, and then also know what the proper role of government. There is precedent in this country for doing these shutdowns for small periods of time. We've actually passed legislation since saying you can't do that. But I look through history, and the courts upheld this stuff, and I'm like, well, there's no way court could say you could just have an indefinite restrictions, which is basically what Fauci was saying. He's like, until there's no deaths and no cases, you can't open your state. That's insane. And so we eventually won the political argument, but it wasn't something that was terribly popular at the time.
You know, I remember seeing a clip of you at the time. I think there was a press conference and a reporter said something to the effect of, Governor DeSantis, aren't you suing the Biden administration, challenging the administration for interfering in the operation of the state? You know, the gist of the question was more or less, isn't it hypocritical of you to then block the cities and counties from doing these types of COVID policies that they want to enact? And you said something to the effect of, the last time I checked, it's the United States of America, not the United Counties or school boards of America. And what do you think of this, of this phenomenon where a lot of people in this room care a lot about state sovereignty and the strength of a state, but what do you think of this phenomenon of state power getting squeezed from the top by the federal governments and then from the bottom by their own cities and counties? And does that leave states weaker when they're getting squeezed from both directions?
Well, we don't allow us to get squeezed from the bottom. We fight back, and it's right. I mean, look, the federal government's powers are few and defined. Those reserved to the states are numerous and indefinite. Madison, Federalist 45. The local governments, cities and counties, they're creatures of the state. The state pre-existed them. We have enacted boundaries for counties and municipalities. And so when people say, how can you fight federal overreach, but then yet want to limit what a local government can restrict their citizens on, that only seems hypocritical if you have no concept of the structure of our government. So keeping the federal government within its proper bounds. So Biden, when he is saying that you have to either get a COVID shot or you would potentially lose your job, and he's doing that through OSHA, through an administrative dictate. They do not have the authority to do that under the Constitution, period. I don't even think Congress could, but to the extent you think Congress could, clearly the executive just unilaterally doing that goes outside the bounds. And even the U.S. Supreme Court agreed. They did not agree on the medical. I think that was a huge mistake. We passed legislation saying nurses did not have to be doctors, nurses could make that decision too. Biden sued us, or Biden fined us, and I paid the fine. I'm like, I don't care. Take the money. I just want to protect the jobs. So we were battling them acting outside their constitutional authority. When I was reigning in local governments, I was acting within the authority of the state, really being the primary political actor in our universe. And so, yes, I think this administration wants to empower the states. I think you're going to see that in a lot of, I mean, the media's hitting Trump on FEMA because he's like, oh, you know, we're going to dismantle FEMA. Like, oh, well, what is Florida going to do of that? Well, first of all, if you tell me the federal government's getting out of that business entirely, I've got a massive surplus, I'll budget more money for disasters, and I'll handle it. Just tell me. Just tell me what you want to do. So I don't need FEMA at all. If you tell me that those programs are not going to be available, I'll change, you know, how we handle things, and we'll get it done. We'll make it happen. But that's not what Trump is saying. What he's saying is, and this is true, if you look at how much a disaster would cost, like how much does a major hurricane cost in certain populated areas, and if you just gave me 80% of that in a block grant and cut FEMA out entirely, that money would go much further than having 20% more filtered through this ridiculous bureaucracy. And I think that's what he wants to do. I think he wants to eliminate the bureaucrats, block grant the money, and then let us make these decisions. Some states will make poor decisions. That's fine. But so much of this bureaucracy is just self-defeating. It defeats the purpose of the program to be able to offer emergency assistance to people. So I do think you're going to see where he's going to try to get that. They're going to try to dismantle education. And now he wouldn't impose some of these mandates that Biden was trying to do. You know, Biden, because we did the women's sports bill, they responded by saying that we were going to be eligible for free and reduced lunch. I mean, think about that. You don't want a 14-year-old girl to have to participate in a track meet against a man, so therefore you're going to take food from hungry kids. I mean, this is woke ideology rung amok. I don't think the Trump administration would want to do any of that stuff, obviously, but I do think that they're going to look to remove bureaucracy. They probably will block grant money to the states. But again, you could block grant a fraction of what you're doing now with no strings attached, and states can do it what they want and probably will do a much better job.
That's really interesting. You gave the example of legislation that Florida passed that the Biden administration then challenged. A lot of what you've talked about is kind of this dialogue between states and the federal government. Sometimes it's a very robust dialogue that involves lots of litigation. And you, in your remarks, mentioned that on the issue of DEI, you took a lot of actions either as an executive or jointly with the legislature to address these issues as the state of Florida. What can you tell us about that experience and more broadly about states like Florida's laboratories of democracy to tackle issues like that?
So we were the first state to eliminate DEI from our public universities. Which was very controversial at the time. See, now DEI is on the defensive. When we were doing this years ago, DEI was on the ascent, and they were saying we were racist, all this other stuff. And I said, listen, DEI, they say it's diversity, equity, and inclusion. If you look at how it's practiced, it's discrimination, exclusion, and indoctrination, and that has no place in our public institutions. Now, my executive agencies, I can just do through executive order. And so that's easy. When you're talking about broader than that, you do need legislation. We also addressed it in the private sector. So we had a bill called the Stop Woke Act. And what we basically said was, a private business cannot force you to undergo woke indoctrination. And they're free to promote whatever they want. They're free to speak however they want. But, as an employee, if they tell you, go to this training where you're going to be taught that white people are bad, you have a right to opt out of that. Now, we got sued on that in front of a liberal judge, and they basically said that we were violating the free speech rights of the company. I don't think that's true. I think this was just a workplace protection. There are obviously things that people are protected from in the workplace that have been upheld, no problem. this is basically a part of Florida's Civil Rights Act. And so that is still ongoing. But we've also just said, well, you know what? We did do the Stop Woke Act, but if you look at some of these practices, even traditional civil rights law, they violate. And so Starbucks and some of these other companies, have come under the microscope for these hiring practices. And it's just basically to create an ethic in society, where people are just going to be judged based on merit. And that's where we're trying to go. So we've had to use different levers to be able to do it. The easiest is just in my own agencies. I can just wave a wand. The universities, it's easy for us to do legally, but when we have legislation, but what happens is they'll eliminate their DEI, then they'll move these employees, and then it's like whack-a-mole. You got to figure out, okay, where are they sending them? Now they're naming it this. Now they're naming it this. So we kind of got to go, and we said, listen, no DEI, you can't be reincarnated under a different name. And so you play that game. Now I think we've gotten it to where it's really on the defensive. But and New College was actually the first college in the country. That was before we even did the legislation. They just abolished it with their board there. And I think that's something that is now you're seeing with the federal government. And I mean, I think I saw an article in the Wall Street Journal. They're like, DEI is vanishing except the NFL. Like they're standing by it, but almost everyone else is kind of running in the other direction because it's ideology. It's not about equal opportunity. It obviously discriminates against groups that are overrepresentative in certain areas. And then the results themselves, as applied to the military and things like that have been, I think, really catastrophic.
So hopefully we've got time for one more question here. You have had experience in the legislative branch, the executive branch. One big part of your legacy is with the judicial branch in the state of Florida. An enduring question for the Federalist Society is, what is the proper role of judges? As a governor, when you're thinking about the right temperament for a judge and what the role and job of a judge is, what do you think the role of a judge is?
So I think I've had an evolution on this. When I first got elected governor, I really wanted somebody that could talk about originalism and talk about, the Federalist Papers and talk about some of the Supreme Court decisions. And I'm not saying you don't want that. And if someone's totally ignorant of that, then they obviously may have problems. So you got to have a philosophical foundation. But to me, the most important ingredient in being a judge at a high level, like a court of last resort or even a federal appeals judge, is courage. You got to have the courage of your convictions. If you're coming at it from the right, when you're rendering proper constitutional or statutory decisions, particularly on cultural issues, your fellow lawyers are overwhelmingly going to oppose that. Law professors are overwhelmingly going to oppose it. Media is overwhelmingly going to oppose it. And so, these are kind of your social circles, right? You get invited to this or that. And that you will get pushback. And some people just don't like that. Look, people want to be liked. They don't want to have criticism. They don't want people to attack them. But the reality is that if you have this foundation, which what the FedSoc has obviously been talking about in law schools for many decades now, if you have that, but you back down from rendering decisions that are going to spark opposition in those major groups, then you're just not doing the job that needs to be done. Part of the reason these judges have life tenure, and in Florida you have a tenure until you're 75 on the state Supreme Court, is because you're not supposed to be swayed by different types of public opinion. And it's one thing to be right on administrative law and rule right on the Chevron doctrine and some of those. And I'm not saying that's not important, but are you going to be willing to go in and rule correctly, against some of these fads, whether it's the gender ideology, whether it's some of these other things? Are you going to be willing to do that, knowing those decisions cut against elite opinion and cut against all these different apertures of our society that you may have connections with, lawyers, law professors, media, all these things? And I found that Justice Thomas relishes this, right? Justice Scalia relished it. Alito like, they want to know they're doing the right thing. And it's almost like when these people have spasms about one of their decisions, like that's proof positive that they ruled correctly. That's not true with some of these other justices, Roberts. They're a little bit more concerned with how they're going to be greeted at the country club or this or that. And I just think that having the courage to be there under fire, and someone like Thomas gets it worse than anybody because he's at the highest court in the land. Alito's obviously gets it very bad. But even like in a state Supreme Court, you're going to have to render decisions that in some quarters are going to be unpopular. And if you have the courage, if you understand that's part of the job, then you are just going to be a better justice than if you don't. And it's not that it's the same as being an elected official, but like if you look back at the COVID stuff, I wasn't the only one who saw this. People just knew if they did what I would do, they were going to have their lunch eaten by the media and by the left, and they didn't want to do that. They did not want to have to face the fire. So I was in a situation where, I was like, this is such a popular governor. Then I was like, people were saying he's the worst and all this other stuff. And then, now people look back and say, thank God we had the governor in charge. But at the time, it's like this. And I'm just like, you know what? On these fundamental things, you've got to get it right. You look in that mirror every morning, know you're doing the right thing for the right reason. If it doesn't work out for you politically, then so be it. That's life. Life's not always fair, but you can't worry. And they were saying, 2020, 2021, like, this guy's dead politically, never going to do anything. He's done all this stuff. And then we ended up 2022, we won the greatest Republican victory that's ever been won in the state of Florida. But that was not something that was obvious at the time. And so you just got to be willing to know. And so now it's like, to me, it's like an art. Like anytime I roll out of bed, the left has a spasm or the media has a spasm. It doesn't matter what I do. They are going to complain. And that you just know you're over the target then. So I take it as positive feedback. But, I've got thick skin. I've been doing this for a while. If you're somebody that's been a lawyer, been a trial judge, and you get into one of these, high courts, you're not used to getting that type of blowback. And it's just human nature that you may not want to deal with it. But if you're not willing to deal with it, you're just never going to be a great judge.
Well, courage is a great place to end this conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here.
All right, thank you.